Welcome to the third section of the ethics module for EDN 3200. Now that we've got a sense of what the topics of ethics is and how it relates to questions of the collective as well as the individual, we can look at education as an ethical practice. Just to recap what we've looked at so far. We've looked at what ethics is and how different flavors and approaches to ethics have generally been formulated, what we called meta-ethics. We described that ethics are normative and involve making judgments about what is good and what is right, based on some ideal that we favor or desire. We saw that there were three broad types of ethical justifications, premised on a deity, on rationality or reason, or on social consensus, but that very few people adhere to only one of these approaches exclusively. We also looked at four pairs of descriptors that allowed us to talk about contradictions and tensions in ethics. These were absolute versus contingent positions, principled versus outcome-based positions, individual versus collective considerations, and short-term versus long-term concerns. In section 2, we explored then the relations between individuals, their actions, and ethical decisions in broader social dynamics of power. We used the ideas of the sociological imagination and of historical awareness to suggest that these could help an individual deliberate what is right and good in relation to the broader social fabric in which she is embedded. We also discussed that people's experiences and how these are patterned by historical and contemporary inequalities would shape the way they reason about what is good and what is right. We also introduced the ideas of monism and pluralism to describe how two people could both use reason and rationality and arrive at two very different types of ideas about what is the right thing. The next two sections, this one and section 4, begin to explore ethics and educating. This section uses a paper by Christie to explore the work of educators in producing ethical people in the world. Section 4 uses a paper by Bista to examine how educators might be ethical themselves. Of course, the two are not cut off from each other. I've titled this section Ethics and Educating, not Education, because I want to foreground that ethics is a practice. It's something we do, not something we are. Given the concepts we've introduced in the last two sections, it is becoming increasingly clear that being ethical is a constantly unfolding pursuit that requires us to remain awake and sensitive to our world and others in it. In her paper Education for an Ethical Imagination, Christie outlines three approaches to thinking about ethics, which we have already touched on in the previous sections, namely ethics as a concern for self-actualization and development, which mostly originated with the ancient Greeks, ethics as a concern to exercise moral authority over ourselves and to act accordingly, that is, basically to behave ourselves, whatever that might mean. And that has mostly been attributed to the work of Immanuel Kant. And ethics as a concern for the well-being of others, outside of which we cannot be human, which is attributed to Emmanuel Levinas. Christie says, what is common to all of them, the terrain of ethics, is the importance of thinking about what constitutes the right and the good, and how we might live in consideration of others. I suggest that ethics is best understood as a common concern with these issues, rather than a stable set of precepts. It is a disposition of continual questioning and adjusting of thought and action in relation to notions of human good and harm. It entails work on the self and consideration of how to be and act in relation to others. And this has taken different forms at different times. That is, rather than as a journey to some predefined end where we arrive and receive a prize, congratulations, you are now an ethical person. We must somehow grapple with ethics as a constant process throughout our lives, of fulfilling our potentials, adhering as best we can to what we believe is good, and doing so in relation to others. The crux of the Christie paper suggests that education is necessarily a normative practice, and hence it is intimately bound up with the terrain of ethics. She says that all discourses of schooling are saturated with assumptions about what counts as progress and development, of what is good and bad, normal and deviant. Whether acknowledged or not, these discourses operate on the terrain of ethics. Schooling makes normative judgments all the time. We shape and mold our students when we evaluate their schoolwork, constrain and or police their clothing or hair, moderate or censor their voices. We decide who may speak, how and when. We regulate their bodies, everything from lining up before class to when they can have a toilet break. We arbitrate their conflicts and disagreements. So not only are we as teachers making normative judgments all the time, and sometimes very tacitly without noticing, we're also inferring to our students how they should be in the world. And in doing so, we shape their own ethical dispositions. This is often called the hidden curriculum. Christie calls on us as teachers to notice that we are, whether we mean to or not, shaping and influencing the ethics of our students and who they are becoming. It's better for us to notice this and to make explicit, careful decisions about this shaping and influence, rather than to just leave it to chance or to replicate our own ideals unconsciously. Christie then outlines three core aspects of developing what she terms an ethical imagination, that is, a mind attuned to thinking ethically. These aspects are a disposition of inquiry, or what she terms ethics of intellectual rigor, engagement in public life, or an ethics of civility, and caring for each other, an ethics of care. Let's look at each of these three a little more closely. The first aspect of an ethical imagination that Christie calls for is an ethics of intellectual rigor. This includes a form of learning and engagement with knowledge that is not just facts, but in-depth understanding and ability to imagine solutions and different situations to what is in front of you, including abstraction, cause and effect, etc. An appreciation of the complexity of human life. What she quotes Habermas as saying, not Habermas, Edward Said, as saying existential density of human life. A recognition of the contingent nature of knowledge and truth-power relations, being able to lay alternative and competing perspectives side by side and evaluate them instead of clinging to a firm immutable truth. To understand that knowledge production is a human engagement, and hence it's saturated with human qualities, both brilliant and fallible. Hang on, Sarah, you might say. Hang on. Surely some subjects have a pretty fixed idea of what is the truth, right? I mean, you're not suggesting, Sarah, that we throw maths out the window, right? You're right, I'm not. Not at all. But I'm a maths teacher, as you well know by now, and I've had some time to think about what my subject means for an ethical imagination. So let's do that as an experiment. Let's think about what intellectual rigor means in the case of a subject like teaching high school maths. Maths is the most extreme example in our current school curriculum of what we might think of as objective and uncontested knowledge. And that's why we like to put a lot of store by it. It's also the most abstracted aspect of the school curriculum. And what do I mean by abstracted? Well, abstraction is the process of teasing out and describing trends, patterns, even laws and rules from everyday events and phenomena. Maths isn't actually about maths is actually exactly this. It is expressing patterns extremely precisely in a generalized and globally accepted written form, using symbols that everyone everywhere can understand and decode. But as an extremely abstracted form of knowledge, maths often detaches itself from the real world, almost seems to float above the messiness of human reality, which is the Platonic view of maths, by the way. And this abstraction can seem to absolve maths from concerns of ethics or messiness. So, what does doing mathematics with intellectual rigor mean? I'd argue it means a few things. I think it involves understanding when maths can tell us something useful about the world and when it can't. That is, recognizing its limitations for accurately reflecting the phenomenon it claims to reflect. I mean, for example, maths can't tell us the full picture about something like love, or dreams, or the brimming humanity of downtown Yeovil. Maths can't capture complex emotions and how we experience them. It can try to measure the chemicals in our blood when we feel them, or predict the chances of a good match on Tinder, but to reduce our feelings to just chemicals and probabilities is a very impoverished view of life. To quote Radiohead, "Karma police, arrest this man, he talks in maths." Another example is right now in the COVID moment. We've been relying on the epidemiological models of mathematics to predict the pandemic and its spread. And while maths is the best tool we've got for this, spoiler alert, epidemiology is far from a precise science, it's becoming increasingly apparent over the last few weeks that the epidemiological models are one of many things that we need to consider when trying to figure out what is the right thing to do about this virus spreading around. To only use the epidemiological models and ignore all the other considerations is to task maths with a burden that it is in this situation unable to carry, namely, what to tell us to do in a complex social situation. Number two, I'd argue that intellectual rigor also involves understanding mathematics as a social practice, which is constantly being built on, refuted, proved, and disproved. So, for example, Bertrand Russell spent years trying to build the foundation of mathematics on set theory, until Kurt Gödel came along and blew a huge hole in his work. You can have a look up of the incompleteness theorem if you're interested in this. Number three, I think teaching mathematics with intellectual rigor implies understanding how maths is wielded for power, with some trying to use numbers to silence others. That, in the words of Ronald Coase, if you torture the data long enough, it'll tell you anything. Again, COVID has given us an excellent example of how numbers can be deployed in a misleading way, where the infection rate of a tested population from 2 weeks ago is being misrepresented as the infection rate of the whole population now. Finally, I'd argue that teaching maths with intellectual rigor means pursuing the practice of maths in a way that tries to go deeply into the subject, asking curious questions rather than just rote learning algorithms and facts, appreciating what parts of maths are rigorous conclusions that follow from particular premises and which other parts are conventions. If you want to understand an example of what I mean by this, look at the Vula folder for the story of Abencorsi. You'll have noticed that my reflections here on what constitutes intellectual rigor for my own subject has required me to notice the relations between my own subject and other disciplines of knowledge. So I'd add a fifth criterion of intellectual rigor to the four I've listed above, by saying that intellectual rigor requires us as teachers to recognize how arbitrary the divisions between subjects in the curriculum are, that we should learn as broadly as we can in an interdisciplinary manner, and we should model this curiosity and connecting to our students. I see this as my ethical imperative towards my students, and if I fail, I impoverish their full appreciation of the beauty of knowledge and how it all links together. Now that we've looked at the ethics of intellectual rigor, let's look at Christie's second idea for an ethical imagination, which she terms an ethics of civility. Here, Christie is saying education as a practice and teachers as practitioners need to guide and show their students how to be part of a political group, to engage in decision-making processes, and be active in holding the powerful to account. The famous moral philosopher Hannah Arendt argued that disengagement from civil processes and politics is the precursor to the banality of evil and totalitarianism. When people no longer feel they belong to the group, or that the decisions made for the group don't concern them, they by default then accept the decisions that others have made in their absence. She argued that doing wrong and evil does not require bad intentions or malicious plans. It's sufficient for a large enough number of everyday people to do nothing, or to not stand up against injustice, and it is this that she termed the banality of evil. Let's throw some hot sauce on this. This means that it's quite interesting to consider that any person who lives in a society cannot be apolitical. By disengaging from civil processes and discussions, you are in fact adopting the position of being okay with the status quo, and that is very political indeed. Inculcating an ethics of civility in ourselves and our students, then, requires us to understand that our actions form part of a broader group in which we live, whether we want them to or not. And hence, we have an ethical obligation to participate and engage in decisions as best we can, so that banal evil cannot take hold. Christie's final aspect of an ethical imagination involves developing an ethics of care. She writes, being human, with all its possibilities and failings, means caring for each other, even those who are not the same as ourselves. She draws on Levinas's interhuman ethic, which posits that we are not fully a person at all until we can engage with another, that we become human through our engagement. We emerge in our full personhood in how we treat and make allowance for another person who is different from ourselves. One could make a plausible argument that this is in essence the morality of Ubuntu, and that it's not just Levinas's approach. It's interesting to think, however, the irony of a collective philosophy that is indeed without a singular author. But this engagement of the other cannot be reduced to sympathy. Quoting Iris Marion Young, Christie takes this engaging with the other into even stranger terrain, suggesting that engagement does not mean empathy or understanding, that being in another person's shoes might not actually be possible at all. Christie writes that this requires a moral humility, recognizing our own limitations in appreciating another person's life and world experience. A good example of the difficulty in this supposed ability to walk in another one's shoes arises from the famous author George Orwell. Orwell decided to try and understand the plight of the homeless by living as a tramp in the streets of London, as documented in his famous memoirs Down and Out in Paris and London. Orwell's intention was to make the plight of those on the margins visible to the middle and upper classes, sharing what he saw and experienced. But could he really understand and capture the lived experience of those on the fringes of society? What if poverty is not the experience of a lack of food, or ragged clothes, or homelessness, but the inescapability of that experience? That there are no options, there are no get me out of here buttons for the poor. While Orwell could terminate his adventures when he'd had enough, or opt to not go play tramp when he didn't feel like it, those he claimed to be in solidarity with had no such fortune. Does this difference fundamentally make their lived experience beyond Orwell's reach? What would moral humility mean for Orwell's good intentions? Adopting an ethics of care, then, must necessarily include not only making space for the needs, interests, and desires of the other, but also not assuming that we can fully understand them. Caring for someone else means not reducing them to who we think they are. As educators, we would need to be willing then to show our students that we can say, I don't know, and I don't understand how you feel, but I do respect your right to feel it. Developing our own and our students' ethical imaginations would involve practicing a moral humility, showing our students that it's actually more ethical to not know what the right thing is all the time, rather than pretending that we do. In truth, these three factors of the ethical imagination are not neat and separate in teaching practice. I'm going to share with you two examples from my own experience in the last school I taught in. In example A, the school I worked in had material resources and conditions that were not good. I found these conditions limited my ability to engage in intellectual rigor with my students, as textbooks, equipment, ICTS, the things I needed to explore my subject in more depth were not available. I could counter this with some creativity, but then this took extra time and energy that I had in short supply. But material under-provision in my own school compelled me to engage more in the ethics of civility, participating in political discussions about school provision in general, which is something very close to my heart and that I continue on to this day. Lobbying and fighting for justice for schools who do not have what they need to effect meaningful teaching and learning is, in my view, also part of my ethical imagination and what it means to care not only for my own students, but for other teachers and students in schools like mine. The second example relates to being a white teacher in a predominantly black school, where an ethic of intellectual rigor compelled me to consider what my position in society meant, economically, culturally, and politically, and how it affects my understanding of knowledge, how this might be different for that for my students. It involved noticing the ways in which things like the standard curriculum is tacitly biased towards someone like me, and not someone like my students, through the language used, through the examples offered, and through the ways of knowing that are valorized. I needed to use both my sociological imagination and historical awareness to appreciate the complexities of these different positions in my classroom, which was a lot more diverse than some might assume. For example, there are a lot of people in Imizamayitu who would self-identify as colored, as well as a lot of immigrants from elsewhere on the continent, for example, the Democratic Republic of Congo. But people presume that Imizamayitu is an exclusively Xhosa township. This ethics of care suggested that I could not, as much as I tried, really understand how my students felt and lived. I had to try and make a space for them to express their lives safely, to let them influence as much as I could how and what we learned together, without doing them the disservice of not enabling them to meet the criteria of the curriculum that had imposed itself on all of us. We would talk about this in class as a game of school, where the rules were set by someone else and were obviously unfair for my students. But my students had to play and beat the game, so that one day they would have the authority to change the rules to something more fair. This was such a contradiction, but my students really got it. What have we covered in this section? We used Christie's paper to explore the idea of an ethical imagination, which is a core concern of education and educating. This includes intellectual rigor in the constant pursuit of knowledge, civil engagement in the political groups we live in, and caring for others without assuming that we can know their full experience. We need to recognize that being ethical is never done, and rather try to aim to be ethical as a completed product, we should rather see ethics as a lifelong pursuit of learning in and of itself, interrogating our assumptions and previously held beliefs, making space for alternative perspectives, and remaining awake to the effects of our actions or lack of actions on others in the world. However, this section is done. In the next section, we will differentiate between accountability and responsibility to question whether an ethical disposition can ever be captured by a set of rules or codes. Thanks for your attention. I'll speak to you soon.